The convoy system had kept Britain alive, but barely. For 3 years, Allied merchant ships had crossed the Atlantic in massive defensive formations. 60, 70, sometimes 80 vessels huddled together under the protection of a handful of destroyers and corvettes. The escorts could only react, darting after U-boats that struck and vanished, always forced to choose between pursuing the attacker and protecting the convoy. USS Bogue changed everything. On March 15, 1943, Captain Short received orders that broke with every principle of Atlantic warfare. Bogue would not escort convoys. She would not wait for U-boats to attack. Instead, she would take her 4 destroyer escorts and hunt German submarines in their own operational areas. The concept was revolutionary, almost reckless. Escort carriers had been designed as convoy guardians, slow, lightly armed conversions of merchant hulls, meant to provide air cover where land-based aircraft couldn't reach. Now, 10th Fleet was sending one deep into U-boat-infested waters with a single mission: kill submarines. What made the gamble possible was ultra. Before we continue, click that subscribe button, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me great joy knowing that these war stories and lessons get to people all over the world. Your support helps us bring more thrilling war stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get back to the story. British cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park had broken the German naval enigma cipher in 1941. But the intelligence had been used cautiously, always filtered through plausible cover stories to prevent the Germans from suspecting their communications were compromised. By early 1943, the volume of decoded traffic had grown overwhelming. U-boat patrol areas, refueling coordinates, wolfpack assembly points, all of it flowed through Allied intelligence centers in near real time. The decoded intercepts revealed something crucial. German supply submarines operated on fixed schedules at predetermined coordinates. The milk cows, Type 14th U-boats, carrying 700 tons of diesel fuel, spare torpedoes, food, and medical supplies, were the lifeline that allowed attack submarines to remain at sea for extended patrols. Without them, U-boats would be forced to return to French bases after 4 weeks, cutting their operational effectiveness in half. Bogue's first patrol orders directed her to a rendezvous point 800 miles west of the Azores. Ultra had identified U-459 and U-487 as active supply submarines servicing wolfpacks in the central Atlantic. Intelligence estimated 6 to 8 attack submarines would converge on these coordinates over a 10-day period. Captain Short understood the implications immediately. His carrier group wouldn't be hunting individual submarines scattered across thousands of square miles. They would be targeting a concentration point, a submarine traffic junction where U-boats were predictable, vulnerable, and distracted by refueling operations. The mission brief was explicit: destroy the milk cows, attack any submarines caught refueling, and prove that American carriers could operate offensively in the mid-Atlantic without convoy protection. On March 20th, Bogue and her escorts reached the designated patrol area. Aircraft launched at dawn, establishing an aerial search pattern covering 40,000 square miles. The Avengers carried depth charges and the new Mark 24 homing torpedoes. The Wildcats flew top cover, protecting the bombers from any Luftwaffe patrols. For 72 hours, they found nothing. Then, on March 23rd, Lieutenant Chamberlain's radar operator called out a surface contact 22 miles distant. The hunt had begun. March 1943 marked the zenith of German submarine power. Admiral Dönitz commanded 240 operational U-boats, more than at any previous point in the war. His wolfpacks roamed the Atlantic in coordinated groups of 15 to 20 submarines, overwhelming convoy escorts through sheer numbers. The statistics told a devastating story. In the first 20 days of March alone, U-boats sank 97 Allied ships, totaling 590,000 tons. Convoy HX-229 lost 13 vessels in a single engagement. SC-122 lost 9. The combined assault represented the largest convoy battle of the entire war. 141 U-boats versus 2 convoys, resulting in 21 merchant ships sent to the bottom in 4 days. British analysts calculated that at current loss rates, the merchant fleet would be reduced to unsustainable levels by autumn. Germany was winning the tonnage war, and they knew it. Morale among U-boat crews remained high. They called themselves the Grey Wolves, and they hunted with confidence bordering on arrogance. But the wolves were about to discover they had become visible. The technologies arriving aboard American escort carriers represented a quantum leap in detection capability. Centimetric radar, operating on 10-centimeter wavelengths, could detect surfaced submarines at ranges exceeding 20 miles in any weather, day or night. German METOX radar detectors, designed to warn U-boats of British metric wavelength radar, were blind to these new frequencies. U-boats equipped with state-of-the-art warning systems surfaced with complete confidence, unaware that American aircraft could see them perfectly. High-frequency direction finding, HFDF, pronounced Huff-Duff, transformed German radio discipline into a liability. Every transmission, even brief encrypted bursts, created radio waves that traveled in straight lines from the source. Multiple HFDF stations could triangulate a U-boat's position to within 10 miles. Dönitz's doctrine requiring frequent communication meant his submarines were constantly broadcasting their locations to Allied tracking rooms. The Mark 24 acoustic homing torpedo completed the technological trap. Disguised as a mine to protect its secret, the Fido torpedo used passive sonar to detect submarine propeller noise. Once dropped near a submerged U-boat, it would circle until it acquired the target's sound signature, then home relentlessly until impact. For the first time in naval history, aircraft could kill submerged submarines. Yet despite these advances, German U-boats retained 3 fundamental vulnerabilities that no technology could eliminate. Physics demanded them. Diesel engines required air. Batteries needed hours of surface charging. A Type XE could patrol submerged for less than a day before power depletion forced it to surface. High-speed evasion underwater drained batteries in minutes, leaving submarines defenseless and unable to maneuver. Radio communications were mandatory. Dönitz controlled his wolfpacks through centralized command, requiring position reports, weather observations, and contact messages. Submarines operating under radio silence couldn't coordinate attacks or receive intelligence updates. Refueling demanded surface operations. Supply submarines couldn't transfer fuel to submerged boats. Refueling took 4 to 6 hours of vulnerable surface time, with both submarines stationary, connected by hoses, unable to dive or maneuver. American hunter-killer groups were designed to exploit every weakness simultaneously. Aircraft patrols timed to catch surfacing submarines, radio triangulation guiding attacks within minutes of transmission, persistent pressure preventing battery recharging. And always, the carriers maintained continuous operations, launching aircraft in rotating schedules that gave U-boats no safe period to surface. The Grey Wolves had operated in darkness. Now, the lights were coming on, May 22nd, 1943. Lieutenant William Chamberlain was 4 hours into his patrol when his radar operator called out the contact. Surface target, bearing 90 degrees, range 18 miles. The Avenger banked toward the contact, losing altitude as Chamberlain armed his depth charges. Captain Lieutenant Hans Johansson had commanded U-569 for 3 months. 7 weeks into his current patrol, fuel reserves had dropped to critical levels. The rendezvous with milk cow U-459 was still 12 hours away. For now, the submarine ran on the surface at 15 knots, diesels hammering as they charged depleted batteries. The bridge watch spotted Chamberlain's aircraft at 8 miles, impossibly long range for visual detection. The alarm shrieked through the boat. Johansen shouted the order every U-boat commander dreaded. Alarm! 35 seconds. That's how long crash dive procedures required. Ballast vents opening, main engines stopping, electric motors engaging, seawater flooding into tanks as the bow angled down. U-569 was at 30 feet when Chamberlain's depth charges arrived. 4 Mark 47 charges set for shallow detonation. The explosions bracketed the submarine perfectly. Hydraulic lines ruptured. Control surfaces jammed. The depth gauge spun wildly as compressed air systems failed. Johansen fought to stabilize the boat, but U-569 was mortally wounded. Her bow broke surface at a steep angle, exposing the forward torpedo room. Lieutenant Howard Roberts was already overhead in a second Avenger. He rolled into his attack run, then abruptly pulled up. White fabric was appearing on U-569's periscope, a makeshift surrender flag made from someone's undershirt. Destroyer escort USS George E. Badger arrived 30 minutes later. German sailors were already abandoning ship as U-569 settled lower in the water. Johansen gave the scuttling order, opening sea valves and setting demolition charges. 25 men survived. 19 went down with the boat. In the Badger's wardroom, Allied intelligence officers began interrogations. The captured Germans were young, most in their early 20s, and they were terrified. Not of their captors, but of what they'd experienced. "How did you find us?" one machinist's mate asked repeatedly. "We had no warning. The aircraft simply appeared." A junior officer was more direct. "They knew exactly where we were. It was as if they could see through the ocean itself." 2 weeks later, on June 5th, USS Bogue's aircraft caught U-217 on the surface, 450 miles west of the Azores. Captain Lieutenant Kurt Reichenbach-Klinke had commanded the submarine through 3 successful patrols, sinking 3 ships. His luck ended at dawn. The first Avenger's depth charges damaged U-217's diving mechanism. Unable to submerge, Reichenbach-Klinke ordered his gun crews topside. The 80mm deck gun and 20mm anti-aircraft weapons opened fire. Shells arcing toward the circling Avengers. 1 Wildcat took minor damage. The submarines fired over 300 rounds in 18 minutes of desperate surface combat. It wasn't enough. A second Avenger delivered depth charges that bracketed the submarine perfectly, fore and aft, port and starboard. The explosions crushed U-217's pressure hull in multiple locations simultaneously. She sank in less than 2 minutes, taking all 50 hands with her. No survivors emerged from the oil slick that marked her grave. Radio intercepts decoded at Bletchley Park revealed the psychological impact spreading through the U-boat arm. Commanders reported crews reluctant to surface, even for essential operations. One patrol report described morale as severely affected by American wonder weapons. The invincible Grey Wolves had discovered fear. By July 1943, the Atlantic had transformed into a grid of overlapping death zones. What began as a single experimental deployment had exploded into a systematic campaign. 5 hunter-killer groups now prowled the ocean, each centered on an escort carrier with destroyer escort screens. USS Bogue, USS Card, USS Core, USS Santee, and USS Croatan. Together, they represented an industrial capacity Germany could never match. Each carrier displaced roughly 10,000 tons and carried 20 to 24 aircraft, Wildcat fighters and Avenger torpedo bombers operating in coordinated search and destroy patterns. Each group covered an operational area of 100,000 square miles, maintaining continuous air patrols that gave U-boats no safe period to surface. Where German submarines had once enjoyed vast expanses of empty ocean, they now faced constant surveillance. The mathematics of coverage were devastating. A single Avenger on patrol could search 15,000 square miles per sortie using centimetric radar. With rotating 4-hour patrols launched every 2 hours, a carrier group maintained persistent detection capability across an area the size of Great Britain. Ultra-intelligence directed these groups to concentration points, refueling zones, patrol boundaries, wolfpack assembly areas, turning the Atlantic into a series of inescapable traps. USS Card, commanded by Captain Arnold Buster Isbell, became the model for hunter-killer doctrine. Between July and October 1943, Card's group would account for 8 confirmed U-boat kills and damage to 3 others, a record that earned the first Presidential Unit citation, awarded to a hunter-killer group. Isbell's tactics were methodical and relentless. Aircraft detected surfaced submarines at extreme range, then attacked immediately before the target could dive. If the U-boat submerged successfully, Card's destroyer escorts moved in with hedgehog mortars and depth charges, maintaining contact until batteries were exhausted and the submarine was forced to surface. The coordination between air and surface units was seamless. Pilots marked dive positions with dive markers and smoke floats, while destroyers closed at flank speed. On August 7th, Card's aircraft located Milk Cow U-117, refueling U-66 on the surface. The supply submarine was caught with fuel hoses still connected, making crash dive impossible. Lieutenant Charles Stapler's Avenger attacked immediately, dropping 4 depth charges that straddled U-117 amidships. The explosion of over 400 tons of diesel fuel created a fireball visible from 30 miles away. The blast vaporized U-117 and her entire crew of 62 men. U-66 managed to crash dive, but was damaged severely by the concussion. She would survive this encounter only to meet her fate 9 months later. The other groups matched Card's aggression. USS Core destroyed 4 U-boats in September alone. USS Bogue added 3 more to her tally. USS Santee and Croatan operated in the South Atlantic, closing escape routes to African waters. German Naval Command watched helplessly as the loss rate accelerated. U-boats that had operated with impunity for years were now being destroyed within days of leaving port. Young commanders on their first patrols vanished without trace. Veteran captains with multiple successful patrols were killed in sudden, overwhelming attacks. By autumn 1943, the industrial reality had become undeniable. America was building escort carriers faster than Germany could train U-boat crews. The Grey Wolves were being hunted to extinction by a weapon system that could be mass-produced and deployed across an entire ocean. October 1943 began with 87 German U-boats on patrol in the Atlantic. By month's end, 23 would be destroyed, the highest monthly loss rate of the entire war. The Grey Wolves weren't just losing, they were being slaughtered. The milk cows died first. U-460 was caught refueling 3 submarines simultaneously on October 4th. Aircraft from USS Card attacked without warning, dropping depth charges that detonated the supply boat's fuel reserves. The explosion killed all 65 crew members and damaged 2 of the submarines being serviced. U-488 followed on October 12th, destroyed by HMS Starling, while attempting to refuel U-641. U-422 went down on October 18th, U-220 on October 28th. By November, not a single Type 14th supply submarine remained operational. Germany's logistical reach across the Atlantic had been severed. Attack submarines could no longer remain at sea for extended patrols. The operational radius that had once extended to the American coast now contracted to the mid-Atlantic. Patrol durations dropped from 8 weeks to 4. Effectiveness plummeted. But the loss of the milk cows only accelerated the carnage. With supply submarines eliminated, attack U-boats were forced to return to French bases more frequently, making them predictable targets in the Bay of Biscay choke point. The veteran commanders were already dead or pulled from service. Günther Prien, Otto Kretschmer, Joachim Schepke, the aces who had terrorized convoys in 1940 and 1941, were gone. In their place came lieutenants barely out of training, commanding crews who had never experienced combat. Kapitän-Leutnant Heinrich Schäfer took command of U-537 at age 23. He had completed submarine school 4 months earlier. His crew averaged 19 years old. On October 9th, off Newfoundland, aircraft from US Escort detected U-537 on the surface. Schäfer's emergency dive procedures were textbook, but textbook wasn't enough. The depth charges caught his boat at 40 feet, crushing the pressure hull. There were no survivors. U-844, commanded by 24-year-old Günther Müller, lasted 3 days longer. Müller made the fatal error of surfacing during daylight to charge batteries, assuming cloud cover would hide his position from aircraft. It didn't. USS Card's radar painted the submarine perfectly through the overcast. Müller and his crew of 47 were killed instantly when Hedgehog mortars detonated against the hull. The pattern repeated with mechanical inevitability. Young commanders made small tactical errors, surfacing too early, remaining on the surface too long, transmitting radio messages unnecessarily. Each mistake was punished immediately. The margin for error had vanished. The Atlantic offered no second chances. Kapitän-Leutnant Klaus Bargsten, commanding U-521 and one of the few surviving veterans, captured the psychological collapse in his war diary entry from October 17th. The Americans appear everywhere simultaneously. Their aircraft arrive without warning. Their weapons are impossibly accurate. We surface for 10 minutes to charge batteries, and they are overhead. We transmit a position report, and destroyers converge within the hour. The ocean has become transparent to them. This is no longer warfare. It is a slaughterhouse. And we are the cattle. By October 31st, Admiral Dönitz faced a statistical reality that ended all debate. U-boats were being destroyed faster than German yards could build them. The loss rate had exceeded the replacement rate. The U-boat arm was dying. The Grey Wolves had learned what Britain and America already knew. Industrial warfare was decided not by courage or skill, but by production capacity and technological superiority. Germany possessed neither. For 3 years, darkness had been the U-boat's ally. Submarines surfaced at night to charge batteries, confident that visual detection was impossible, and that British metric radar was ineffective against low-profile targets. By November 1943, that sanctuary no longer existed. Centimetric radar combined with Lee lights transformed night into day. American Avengers could detect surface submarines at 20 miles in absolute darkness, then illuminate targets with million-candle-power searchlights mounted in the wings. U-boats that surfaced after sunset found themselves pinned in blinding white light, unable to see their attackers while perfectly visible themselves. But the Americans weren't finished. Magnetic anomaly detectors, MADI, sensors that detected distortions in Earth's magnetic field caused by steel hulls, could locate submerged submarines at ranges up to 400 yards. Sonobuoys dropped by aircraft created underwater listening posts, triangulating propeller noise from multiple positions. The ocean itself had become hostile. Submarines could no longer hide in depth or darkness. The confrontations grew desperate and brutal. November 1st, 1943, USS Bory, a flush-deck destroyer escort, detected U-405 on surface radar at 11:47 p.m. Commander Charles Hutchins ordered flank speed, charging directly at the submarine. Kapitän-Leutnant Rolf Heinrich Hoppmann saw the destroyer approaching and made a fatal decision. Rather than dive, he would fight on the surface. U-405's 20mm cannon opened fire. Bory responded with her 4-inch guns and 50-caliber machine guns. At 400 yards, Hopman attempted to ram. Hutchins turned hard to port, but the vessels collided at 20 knots, locking together bow-to-bow like medieval warships. What followed was the only hand-to-hand combat between surface vessels in the Atlantic War. Bory's crew hurled coffee mugs, empty shell casings, and anything not bolted down at German sailors on the submarine's deck. A machinist's mate threw a sheath knife that pinned a German officer's hand to the conning tower. Rifles and submachine guns fired at point-blank range. The vessels separated after 10 minutes of carnage. U-405 attempted to dive, but her damaged hull couldn't withstand the pressure. She surfaced again, and Bory finished her with depth charges. 40 of U-405's crew died. 7 survived as prisoners. Bory herself was so severely damaged she had to be scuttled the next day. 8 days later, U-172 experienced a different kind of hell: systematic technological pursuit. On November 9th, aircraft from USS Bogue detected Captain Lieutenant Carl Emmerman's submarine charging batteries southwest of the Azores. Emmerman crash-dived immediately, beginning a 14-hour ordeal that would destroy his boat without a single depth charge hitting the hull. Bogue's destroyer escorts established sonobuoy patterns around the dive point. Every time U-172 attempted to change course or depth, new contacts appeared. Mad equipment tracked the submarine's position continuously. Emmerman ran silent at slow speed, conserving battery power, but the Americans simply waited. Hour after hour, the net tightened. Battery levels dropped steadily, 80%, 60%, 40%. The air grew foul as carbon dioxide levels rose. Men collapsed from oxygen deprivation. Emmerman had 2 choices: surface and face certain destruction, or remain submerged and suffocate. At 02:15 on November 10th, with batteries at 12% and crew members losing consciousness, Emmerman ordered emergency surface. 172 broke through in the glare of lee lights. Depth charges bracketed her within seconds. The crew abandoned ship as the submarine settled by the stern. 53 men died. 6 survived. Technology had erased every advantage submarines once possessed. There was no more darkness, no more depth, no more escape. By January 1944, the arithmetic had become inescapable. German shipyards completed 22 new U-boats that month. Allied forces destroyed 26. In February, 20 were built and 23 destroyed. March saw 24 commissioned and 27 sunk. The U-boat arm was consuming itself, feeding men and machines into a meat grinder that operated with industrial efficiency. Admiral Dönitz faced an impossible equation. The submarines were available. Production had actually increased. But the experienced commanders were dead. The veteran crews were gone. In their place came boys barely old enough to shave, thrust into command of vessels they scarcely understood, leading crews who had never heard a depth charge detonate. Captain Lieutenant Heinz Franke took command of U-262 at age 23. He had completed submarine training 6 months earlier and received command qualification after an abbreviated 3-week course. His executive officer was 22. His chief engineer was 21. Of the 48-man crew, only 3 had previously served on operational patrols. U-262 departed Brest on February 4, 1944. She was detected by aircraft from USS Block Island on February 9th while crossing the Bay of Biscay. Franke attempted to crash dive, but his crew was too slow. Critical seconds lost as inexperienced men fumbled with unfamiliar controls. Depth charges caught the submarine at 30 feet. There were no survivors. U-262's patrol lasted 5 days. Oberleutnant zur See Wolfgang Schmidt commanded U-641, his first patrol as captain. He was 24 years old and had served on submarines for less than a year. On February 19th, northwest of Ireland, his lookouts spotted an aircraft too late. Schmidt's dive order came 4 seconds slower than doctrine required, the difference between survival and death. The Avenger's depth charges destroyed U-641 with all hands. Schmidt's patrol lasted 11 days, the pattern repeated with horrifying regularity. U-603, first patrol, destroyed after 6 days. U-744, first patrol, destroyed after 8 days. U-801, first patrol, destroyed after 12 days. Entire boats vanished without sending a single radio message. Their fates unknown until decoded German communications revealed they were missing. Training couldn't compensate for lost experience. The submarine school at Pillau could teach dive procedures and torpedo calculations, but it couldn't replicate the instincts developed through months of evading depth charges. Young commanders followed the manual perfectly and died anyway. The manual was written for an Atlantic that no longer existed. Families in Germany received Kriegsmarine telegrams with increasing frequency. Your son died for Führer and fatherland in the Battle of the Atlantic. No details, no explanation, just the bare acknowledgement that another U-boat had failed to return. The veteran crews, those who had survived 1943, watched the slaughter with numb horror. They trained the replacements, knowing most would be dead within weeks. Some volunteered for additional patrols simply because refusal meant watching untrained officers take their boats to certain destruction. Kapitän-Leutnant Bargston, one of the few surviving aces, wrote in April 1944, "We are sending children to fight machines. They don't lack courage, they lack time. Time to learn, time to understand, time to survive their mistakes. The Americans don't make mistakes anymore. We make nothing but mistakes. This is not warfare. This is sacrifice without purpose." By spring 1944, the U-boat arm had become a death sentence for an entire generation. They sailed knowing the odds. They died knowing they never had a chance. June 4th, 1944. 500 miles west of Africa, USS Guadalcanal's destroyer escorts detected a submerged contact. Kapitän-Leutnant Harold Lang commanded U-505, a Type Wind-C submarine on her 12th patrol. What happened next was unprecedented in naval warfare. Hedgehog mortars from USS Chatelain detonated near U-505's hull, causing severe damage, but not destruction. Lange ordered emergency surface, hoping to scuttle before the Americans could close. The submarine broke through at a steep angle, crew members scrambling topside to abandon ship. Commander Daniel Gallery, commanding the Guadalcanal group, made an instantaneous decision that violated all doctrine. He would capture the submarine intact. A boarding party from USS Pillsbury, led by Lieutenant Albert David, approached the still-moving U-boat in a whaleboat. The submarine was taking on water, bow settling, engines still running. David and 8 sailors leapt onto the deck, entered the conning tower, and descended into a vessel that could sink beneath them at any moment. The interior was chaos, lights flickering, water spraying from ruptured pipes, demolition charges armed but not yet detonated. The boarding party worked frantically, disarming charges, closing valves, stopping the flooding. Within 20 minutes, they had stabilized U-505. Within an hour, she was under tow. The intelligence hall was staggering. Codebooks showing current Enigma key settings. Acoustic torpedoes with their guidance systems intact. Navigation charts marking known minefields and patrol routes. Radio equipment revealing frequency allocations. Technical manuals describing every system aboard Type 9 submarines. 58 crew members captured alive, ready for interrogation. U-505 represented the greatest intelligence coup of the Atlantic War. The submarine itself would be studied, tested, and eventually displayed in Chicago as a war memorial. But her capture demonstrated something more profound. American forces now operated with such overwhelming superiority, they could board enemy vessels in combat conditions. The Germans never learned U-505 had been captured. The crew was isolated in POW camps where no communication was possible. Allied intelligence maintained the deception, allowing continued use of compromised codes for months. 2 days after U-505's capture, the Normandy invasion began. German U-boats stationed in French ports received emergency orders to attack the invasion fleet in the English Channel. 30 submarines sailed into the Bay of Biscay choke point, where Allied aircraft waited in overwhelming strength. The massacre lasted 1 week. June 6th, U-970 destroyed by RAF Liberator. June 7th, U-441 sunk by depth charges, U-629 destroyed by rocket fire. June 8th, U-373 caught on surface and obliterated. June 9th, U-821 and U-740 destroyed within hours of each other. June 10th, U-955 sunk, U-988 damaged beyond repair. By June 12th, 15 U-boats had been destroyed in 7 days, the highest weekly loss rate ever recorded. Aircraft from RAF Coastal Command and U.S. Navy patrol squadrons maintained continuous coverage of the Bay of Biscay. Centimetric radar detected every surfaced submarine. Lee lights illuminated night attacks. Rocket-armed aircraft shredded conning towers before U-boats could dive. The submarines attempting to reach the invasion fleet never got close to Normandy. Most were destroyed within 200 miles of their French bases. The few that survived turned back, their commanders reporting conditions as impossible and suicidal. Admiral Dönitz ordered the remaining U-boats to remain in port. For the first time since 1939, German submarines effectively withdrew from active operations in the Atlantic. The grey wolves had been hunted to extinction. What remained was simply the formality of ending a war already decided. German Naval Command responded to the catastrophe with technological countermeasures, but every innovation arrived after Allied superiority had already become absolute. The schnorkel, a breathing tube allowing diesel operation while submerged at periscope depth, was introduced fleet-wide in late 1944. German engineers claimed it would restore U-boat effectiveness by eliminating the need to surface for battery charging. In practice, the schnorkel created as many problems as it solved. The device produced a distinctive radar signature, a small but detectable contact that Allied operators learned to recognize instantly. The tube's wake created a visible disturbance on calm seas, easily spotted by aircraft. Engine vibration transmitted through the schnorkel created acoustic signatures that sonobuoys detected at extended ranges. Worst of all, wave action frequently submerged the intake valve, causing violent pressure fluctuations that ruptured eardrums and induced disorientation in crews. U-482, one of the first schnorkel-equipped boats, discovered these limitations fatally. On September 16, 1944, aircraft from HMS Thane detected the submarine's schnorkel northwest of Scotland. Kapitän-Leutnant Hartmut Graf von Matuschka attempted to dive deeper, but the schnorkel's limited depth capacity forced him to remain vulnerable. Depth charges destroyed U-482 with all hands. The Americans responded to schnorkels with upgraded Mark 24 torpedoes, featuring improved acoustic tracking and depth-keeping mechanisms. The new variants could pursue targets through evasive maneuvers and maintain contact in rough seas. Submarines that once might have escaped through radical course changes now found homing torpedoes following them relentlessly. Radar improvements accelerated. New centimetric sets could detect schnorkel tubes at ranges exceeding 8 miles in moderate seas. Airborne radar operators developed pattern recognition skills that distinguished schnorkels from wave returns with near-perfect accuracy. By early 1945, U-boats equipped with state-of-the-art schnorkels were being destroyed as quickly as older models. The attempted revival of wolfpack tactics ended in massacre. On January 3, 1945, 8 U-boats formed Gruppe Stier off the Norwegian coast, attempting to intercept convoy JW-63 bound for Murmansk. Ultra-intelligence decoded their positions within hours. British and American escort carriers converged on the Wolfpack before it could close with the convoy. The engagement lasted 9 hours. 5 U-boats were destroyed, 2 severely damaged, 1 forced to abort with mechanical failures. Only U-992 escaped undamaged, and only because her commander broke radio silence to warn others, then fled at maximum speed toward Norwegian coastal waters. The convoy suffered no losses. It was the last Wolfpack operation of the war. Individual U-boats continued sailing through early 1945, but their missions had devolved into desperation. Patrol areas were restricted to coastal waters, where Allied air superiority made operations suicidal. Commanders received orders to attack targets of opportunity, while knowing survival was statistically impossible. U-546 departed Bergen on April 24, 1945, one of the final operational patrols. She was detected by USS Mission Bay on April 29th and destroyed after a brief surface engagement. Of her 60-man crew, only 33 survived to surrender. U-320 sailed from Bergen on April 30th, the day Hitler committed suicide in Berlin. She was sunk on May 5th by depth charges from HMS Red Mill. There were no survivors. The technological race was over. Germany had lost not because they lacked innovation, but because innovation without industrial capacity was meaningless. Every German countermeasure arrived months late and in insufficient numbers, while American production accelerated without pause. By January 1945, German U-boat bases had become graveyards for living vessels. Submarines lined the piers at Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and Bergen, fully fueled, armed, and crewed, but unable to sail without facing certain destruction within days. The statistics were unambiguous. Of 36 U-boats that departed on patrol in January 1945, 22 were destroyed before month's end. February saw 18 departures and 14 losses. In March, commanders began refusing patrol orders, citing operational impossibility rather than cowardice. Courts-martial followed, but even the threat of execution couldn't change mathematics. Allied air superiority over European waters had become absolute. RAF Coastal Command and U.S. Navy patrol squadrons maintained continuous coverage of every known U-boat transit route. Centimetric radar, MAD equipment, and acoustic homing torpedoes operated with such efficiency that submarine detection was essentially guaranteed. The question wasn't whether a U-boat would be found, but how quickly. Young crews sat in their boats, listening to diesel engines idling, knowing that departure meant death. Some commanders developed phantom mechanical problems to justify remaining in port. Others simply stated the truth. Sailing was suicide, and no tactical objective justified sending men to certain destruction. The final patrols were acts of pointless sacrifice. U-546 departed Bergen, Norway, on April 24, 1945, commanded by Oberleutnant Zursee Paul Just. His orders were to intercept Allied shipping off the American coast, an objective that had been impossible since 1943. Just was 24 years old. Most of his crew had never been to sea. On April 29th, 5 days into her patrol, U-546 was detected by escort carrier USS Mission Bay, operating east of Newfoundland. Just attempted to fight on the surface, his deck gun engaging the destroyers closing on his position. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. Depth charges and gunfire from USS Flaherty and USS Nunze destroyed U-546's pressure hull. The submarine sank with 27 crew members. Paul Just and 33 others survived as prisoners. U-320 sailed from Bergen on April 30, 1945. the day Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker. Oberleutnant zur See, Erwin Dorn, commanded a crew that had trained for 8 months but never conducted an operational patrol. They sailed knowing Germany was collapsing, that the war was effectively over, that their mission served no strategic purpose. HMS Red Mill detected U-320 on May 5th using Type 147B sonar. The destroyer closed to 600 yards and released a pattern of hedgehog mortars. Multiple detonations against the hull shattered U-320's pressure hull. She sank in 200 feet of water with all 53 hands. There were no survivors. 3 days later, Germany surrendered. Of 1,162 U-boats commissioned during the war, 785 were destroyed. Over 28,000 submariners sailed on patrol. 28,000 never returned, a casualty rate of 75%, the highest of any military service in World War II. In his final report to the remnants of German Naval Command, Admiral Karl Dönitz wrote with bitter clarity, "The U-boat arm was not defeated by better sailors, but by better systems. We faced an enemy who integrated intelligence, technology, and industrial production into a weapon we could neither counter nor escape. Our men showed courage beyond measure. But courage cannot defeat radar, cannot evade homing torpedoes, cannot overcome an enemy that sees everything and produces endlessly. We were not outfought. We were overwhelmed by an industrial and scientific superiority that rendered traditional naval warfare obsolete. The grey wolves were extinct. The Atlantic Ocean floor became the largest underwater graveyard in human history. More than 500 German U-boats rest in the darkness, steel tombs scattered across 3,000 miles from the American coast to the approaches of the English Channel. Each represents not just machinery and men, but the death of a doctrine that believed stealth and seamanship could overcome systematic technological superiority. The hunter-killer groups proved a principle that would define modern warfare. Integrated systems defeat individual excellence. A well-trained U-boat crew commanded by an experienced captain could not survive an environment where radar detected them at 20 miles. Aircraft arrived within minutes, homing torpedoes pursued them underwater, and intelligence decoded their orders before they received them. The Battle of the Atlantic transformed anti-submarine warfare from an art into a science. The techniques developed between 1943 and 1945, coordinated air-surface operations, electronic surveillance, acoustic tracking, data-driven targeting, became the foundation of Cold War naval doctrine. When the Soviet Union fielded its submarine fleet in the 1950s, NATO applied lessons learned hunting U-boats, escort carriers, destroyer screens, sonobuoy networks, and magnetic anomaly detection. The technological advances didn't end with Germany's surrender. Centimetric radar evolved into modern phased array systems capable of tracking hundreds of targets simultaneously. Acoustic homing torpedoes became sophisticated weapons using digital signal processing and artificial intelligence. The Mark 24, Fido, that destroyed U-boats in 1944, was the ancestor of weapons like the Mark 48 Aid Cap, a torpedo that can travel 38 miles and distinguish between different vessel types. But beyond technology, the Atlantic campaign demonstrated industrial capacity as a strategic weapon. Germany built 1,162 U-boats during 6 years of war. America produced 122 escort carriers in 4 years, along with thousands of aircraft, tens of thousands of depth charges, and millions of tons of supporting equipment. The submarines were individually superior vessels crewed by brave men. They were overwhelmed by mass production, backed by scientific research. The human cost remained staggering. 28,000 German submariners died, 75% of those who served. Allied merchant sailors suffered similarly catastrophic losses, over 30,000 killed, 4,500 ships sunk. The North Atlantic became a killing ground where industrial warfare consumed lives with mechanical efficiency. Veterans of both sides would later describe a peculiar, shared understanding. German submarine commanders who survived spoke of Americans with professional respect, not for their courage, which was assumed, but for their systems. Allied pilots and destroyer captains acknowledged that German crews fought with skill and determination until the moment technological superiority made skill irrelevant. The wreckage remains. U-505 sits preserved in Chicago's Museum of Science and Industry, the only intact U-boat in America, a monument to the men who captured her and the technology that made capture possible. Hundreds of others corrode slowly in the darkness, unmarked graves for a generation that died, learning the future belonged not to traditional warriors, but to integrated weapons systems. The Atlantic became proof that modern warfare is decided not on battlefields, but in research laboratories, factory assembly lines, and intelligence centers. Technology, properly integrated and industrially scaled, renders tradition obsolete. The grey wolves discovered this truth too late. The world never forgot.